Arminius and his accomplices. That night is my witness. Would that it had been my last. What followed may be deplored rather than defended. However, I threw Arminius into chains, and I endured to have them put on myself by his partisans; and as soon as given opportunity, I showed my preference for the old over the new, for peace over commotion, not to get a reward, but that I might clear myself from treachery, and be at the same time a fit mediator for the German people, should they choose repentance rather than ruin. For the youth and error of my son I entreat forgiveness. As for my daughter, I admit that it is by compulsion that she has been brought here. It will be for you to consider which fact weighs most with you, that she is with child by Arminius, or that she owes her being to me. Caesar, in a gracious reply, promised safety to his children and kinsfolk, and a home for himself in the old province. He then led back the army, and received on the proposal of Tiberius the title of Imperator. The wife of Arminius gave birth to a male child. The boy, who was brought up at Ravenna, soon afterwards suffered an insult, which at the proper time I shall relate. The report of the surrender and kind reception of Segestes, when generally known, was heard with hope or grief according as men shrank from war or desired it. Arminius, with his naturally furious temper, was driven to frenzy by the seizure of his wife and the foredooming to slavery of his wife's unborn child. He flew hither and thither among the Cherusci, demanding war against Segestes, war against Caesar. And he refrained not from taunts. Noble the father, he would say, mighty the general, brave the army which, with such strength, has carried off one weak woman. Before me 3 legions, 3 commanders have fallen, not by treachery, not against pregnant women, but openly against armed men do I wage war. There are still to be seen in the groves of Germany the Roman standards which I hung up to our country's gods. Let Segestes dwell on the conquered bank, let him restore to his son his priestly office. One thing there is which Germans will never thoroughly excuse, their having seen between the Elbe and the Rhine the Roman rods, axes, and toga. Other nations, in their ignorance of Roman rule, have no experience of punishments, know nothing of tributes, and as we have shaken them off, as the great Augustus, ranked among deities, and his chosen heir Tiberius, departed from us, baffled, let us not quail before an inexperienced stripling, before a mutinous army. If you prefer your fatherland, your ancestors, your ancient life, to tyrants and to new colonies, follow as your leader Arminius to glory and to freedom, rather than Segestes to ignominious servitude. This language roused not only the Cherusci, but the neighboring tribes, and drew to their side Inguiomerus, the uncle of Arminius, who had long been respected by the Romans. This increased Caesar's alarm. That the war might not burst in all its fury at one point, he sent Caecina through the Bructeri to the river Amisia with 40 Roman cohorts to distract the enemy, while the cavalry was led by its commander Pedo through the territories of the Frisii. Germanicus himself put 4 legions on shipboard and conveyed them through the lakes, and the infantry, cavalry, and fleets met simultaneously at the river already mentioned. The Chauci, on promising aid, were associated with us in military fellowship. Lucius Stertinius was dispatched by Germanicus with a flying column, and routed the Bructeri as they were burning their possessions, and, amid the carnage and plunder, found the eagle of the 19th legion, which had been lost with Varus. The troops were then marched to the furthest frontier of the Bructeri, and all the country between the rivers Amisia and Lupia was ravaged, not far from the forest of Taetoburgium, where the remains of Varus and his legions were said to lie unburied. Germanicus, upon this, was seized with an eager longing to pay the last honor to those soldiers and their general, while the whole army present was moved to compassion by the thought of their kinsfolk and friends, and indeed of the calamities of wars and the lot of mankind. Having sent on Caecina in advance to reconnoitre the obscure forest passes, and to raise bridges and causeways over watery swamps and treacherous plains, they visited the mournful scenes, with their horrible sites and associations. Varus's first camp, with its wide circumference, and the measurements of its central space clearly indicated the handiwork of 3 legions. Further on, the partially fallen rampart and the shallow fosse suggested the inference that it was a shattered remnant of the army which had there taken up a position. In the centre of the field were the whitening bones of man, as they had fled, or stood their ground, strewn everywhere or piled in heaps. Near lay fragments of weapons and limbs of horses, and also human heads prominently nailed to trunks of trees. In the adjacent groves were the barbarous altars, on which they had immolated tribunes and first-rank centurions. Some survivors of the disaster, who had escaped from the battle or from captivity, described how this was the spot where the officers fell, how yonder the eagles were captured, where Varus was pierced by his first wound, where too by the stroke of his own ill-starred hand he found for himself death. They pointed out too the raised ground from which Arminius had harangued his army, the number of gibbets for the captives, the pits for the living, and how in his exultation he insulted the standards and eagles. End of Book 1, Part 3.